All right. So, and then I've got the chat open as well. So if any of you guys have questions as I'm going, feel free to put your questions in the chat, or you can unmute and ask your questions as well. I have started recording for the students who wouldn't get a chance to see this. It's set up so that it's only recording my camera. So if your picture is on, it won't record you. But if you unmute and you talk, it will get your voice if that's something that you care about. All right. First thing that I want to let you guys know, the last unit test has been graded. They're going to go in the grade book, hopefully tonight, maybe tomorrow. I'm sorry I didn't get them in for the progress report. I tried to get them all graded this weekend. I just did not have enough time. To do that. So, alrighty. So one of the things that I decided is that I want to try to, I'm going to change the pacing a little bit. So I think what you'll see is like next week will be, the lessons will be, fairly kind of what it's like it's been. And then it'll begin to kind of tail off after that. But I did try to, I re-looked at my calendar to try to figure out kind of my pacing. One of the things that I decided is that today I'm only going to go over the Phillips curve with you guys in aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So how those are connected. I'm going to go over that with you. I'm going to be doing the multiplier. That's going to be next week. So next week will be multiplier, fiscal policy, and then the money market will be next week for sure. And maybe a little bit of maybe monetary policy as well next week. But next week is going to be the multiplier and fiscal policy, and then maybe a little bit of monetary policy, money market as well. So, all right. So what I want you guys to do to begin with, again, like I said, I'm going to have you guys doing some stuff this time. I want you guys to do number one up here. So I want you to draw a side-by-side graph of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and then long run and short run Phillips curves and at full employment. So I want aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and then long run and short run Phillips curves, side-by-side graphs, right, at full employment. So on a piece of paper, pen or pencil, I want you to work on that now. And I'm going to give you guys like, I don't know, a minute to start working on that. So maybe you don't know what the Phillips curve is, or you're not really sure how to do that. That's fine. You should be able to do aggregate demand, aggregate supply at full employment anyways. Side by side means like this, putting the two graphs right next to each other. So I'll give you guys a minute to work on that. And then I'll start going over this with you so that it's hopefully will make a lot of sense. And ideally by the end of this today, not only will you be really solid on the Phillips curve, but you'll also be even more solid on aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Like all the pieces should start coming together for you today. So that's kind of what we're working on. All right, so I'll give you a minute. All right, so while you're working on this, I'm going to talk to you guys real quick about kind of what the Phillips curve is, and then I'll start going over the answer to this and how it all ties in. Remember that macroeconomics is not that old of a field of study. Macroeconomics, really is during the Great Depression in the 1930s is when most of our modern ideas of macroeconomics were created. Not long after that. Probably 1950s, 1960s, you get this economist and he decides that he's going to make a graph, right? Just a real simple graph looking at inflation rate and unemployment rate And he decides that he's going to just start graphing some historical data in here. So he starts looking at years in the past. What was the inflation rate for that year? What was the average unemployment rate for that year? And he just starts plugging some data in, right? So he goes, boom, maybe it's like 5% unemployment, 3% inflation. All right, he goes and he grabs another year, and he grabs another year, and another one, and another one. And he starts plugging these years in on his graph. And he gets a distribution that looks kind of like this, right? Where there's all these points, but they're clustered in a way that you could see a real strong inverse relationship here between inflation and unemployment. So that if we were to put like a trend line in, it would be something like that. Or maybe it would be something like this, right? It might be curved, it might be straight, it doesn't really matter. But this right here, this is what we call our short run Phillips curve. That in the short run, during a 1 year period, my inflation rate and my unemployment rate, there seems to be a real strong relationship here, right? Between these, right? Now, in fact, this graph right here called the Phillips curve, this is actually what, like, if you remember back to like week 2, when I was going over the measures of the economy, that if you remember like the measures of the economy, it's the like the too hot and the too cold, or it's like the, you could think of like a teeter-totter that's balancing between like inflation and unemployment, and that trade-off between inflation and unemployment on the other side, right? Where like, that trade-off between those two problems, that's what this graph right here shows, is that there's this relationship between unemployment and inflation. And that when unemployment goes down, inflation tends to go up. And when unemployment goes up, inflation tends to go down. So that we have the trade-off between these two problems, between recession and inflation, the trade-off between those two problems, it all comes back to the Phillips curve. So let's tie this in. Let's connect this into aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So I asked you to draw side-by-side graphs. This is something that I could ask you to do on my test. This is something you can see on an AP test, is to do side-by-side graphs of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and the Phillips curve. So before I draw these, right, I want to actually get in here and I want to look more carefully. I want to look at the axes of these two graphs first, right? So we have price level here on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. We have inflation here on the short long run Phillips curve, right? Now, if you think about price level versus inflation, they're really two things that it's like measuring the same thing twice. It's kind of like height in centimeters and height in inches. They're almost exactly the same thing. So what that means is, right, whatever my Y value on this graph has got to be the same Y value on this graph if they're the same thing. So that if my Y is 10 here, it's got to be 10 here. Maybe not like 10, 10, but it would have to be the equivalent. So like 10 inches or 30 centimeters, right? Like that's what we're talking about here, is that they've got to be like lined up because they're measuring the same thing. The x-axis, however, right, you've got real GDP on my aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. We've got unemployment on my Phillips curve. So what does that mean? Well, what's the relationship between GDP and unemployment? Right? Well, the relationship between GDP and unemployment is that they're opposites. This is production. This is the opposite of production. The more output we produce, the more workers we need. The more workers we're using, the lower unemployment gets. So really what we have here is this is X. This graph over here is really the graph of negative X. So that it's the same information, X and Y, but it's being displayed in a slightly different way, negative X and Y, right? So to give you an idea of like what this is going to end up meaning for us, right? We can look at like, right? We could set up, you know, a coordinate plane here, and then we can graph some x, y's. So maybe I'm going to use, you know, maybe I want to graph 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, right? And now I'm going to graph x, y, but I'm also going to graph negative x, y. Maybe I'll use a different color for that. So my graph of negative x, y, negative 0 is still 0, negative 1, 1, negative 2, 2, negative 3, 3, and negative 4, 4. So all I've done is I've just taken my x's and I've just made a negative x, but I've kept y the same for all of these points, right? And then I'm going to plot them on this graph. 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4. And then here, 0, 0, negative 1, 1, negative 2, 2, negative 3, 3, negative 4, 4. What we see, right, when we show the graph of y negative x, what we see is a reflection of the graph of y and x. So what we're really doing here with these side-by-side graphs is we're really just it's really the same thing, but reflected, right? So like, if this one is, you know, if this is what my graph looks like over here, it's going to look like this, right? That the y-axis is not changing, but the x-axis is the opposite. So to give you guys like a real world thing that behaves the same way, right? This is how mirrors work, right? You look in a mirror and the y doesn't change, right? You look in a mirror, and if you're looking in a mirror, like right now I'm looking at my computer and it's kind of like a mirror, right? Because it's showing me what it's seeing right now, right? If you look in a mirror and you like stand up taller, right? You move up, mirror you moves up as well, right? Because the y's are the same, right? You both go up, you both go down. But if you're looking in a mirror and you hold up your right hand, mirror you holds up their left hand, right? Because it's reflecting across, right? The x's are reflecting across my y-axis is essentially what's happening. So that's what we're going to see in this graph. Whatever we put over here is going to reflect onto this side over here, with one exception. All right, so that's really what we're doing here. So I gave you a little context. Let's go through and let's do this, right? Side-by-side graphs of aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and long run and short run Phillips curves at full employment. So whenever you have one of these side-by-side graph problems with aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and the Phillips curves, you should always start it the same way, right? So we've got our axes here. The way we're going to start it is we're going to draw this. We're going to draw an X over here, and then we're going to draw one line over here, right? And then we can label these so we know what they are. So this is my short run Phillips curve. This is aggregate demand. And that's my short run aggregate supply. All right. So I've got my curves here labeled. Sorry if there's like if the lamp is, or if there's a reflection from the windows or the lights or whatever that's in the way. So this is how we start, right? We start with my X, with my short run curves is what we start with. Now, wherever your short run curves intersect, that's your current equilibrium. So I'm going to label this right here. That's my current price level. All right. Next step on any of these side-by-side graphs is we want to line up the Y values because the Y values are going to be equivalent or the same. So I want to line it up. All right, a couple of things. First of all, if you're having a hard time seeing what this is right here, it's the symbol pi. That's what we use as the abbreviation for inflation. We use pi because the letter I was already used for interest rate in economics. So we use pi to stand in for inflation. I want you to notice that we get a horizontal, that it lines up horizontally. My price and my inflation rate are the same on the y-axis. What that means, once they're lined up, if this one goes up, this one goes up. If this one goes down, this one goes down, right? That they're going to stay lined up if you start off lined up. So we've got them lined up. It's a good starting spot. Also notice that here I've got an equilibrium, but over here I had to show my equilibrium with the dots. Right? Usually we'll label it A to start with, and then if it moves, we'll go to B, and if it moves again, we'll go to C, and so on and so forth with the Phillips curve. So why did I have to color in my dot? Why did I have to label it with the letter A? Well, the reason why is because, remember I said that this is a reflection of this over here, right? But there's something missing. So let's talk about what's here and what's missing on my short run Phillips curve graph right here. First of all, let's look at what this short run Phillips curve is, right? It might look like a demand curve, but it is not. This is definitely not my demand curve because this is mirrored. So what you're seeing here, right, on my mirror, the mirror of this is this. This is the mirror of my short run aggregate supply. So your short run Phillips curve is the mirror of your short run aggregate supply. Here's what's awesome about that. You don't have to memorize any shifters for the short run Phillips curve, right? Because if this shifts, this is going to shift the opposite way because it's a mirror. If I move my hand closer to the mirror, mirror means hand moves closer. If I move my hand further away, mirror means hand moves farther away. So if this line moves closer, then this line moves closer. If this line moves further away, then this line moves further away. So there's no new shifters here because this is just the mirror of short run aggregate supply, right? So then hopefully you're noticing right now we're missing something. There is no mirror of aggregate demand. It's invisible basically. That what we really have going on here is that there's really an invisible aggregate demand cutting through here, and that's what determines where that equilibrium point is. So this point A right here really is an equilibrium. It's just that we don't show aggregate demand on this graph because we want the focus to be on the relationship between inflation and unemployment, right? We want to show the relationship between these two measures in the economy. That's where our focus is. So that's why we don't see aggregate demand on this graph, is that we just keep it hidden so that we focus on this. But there's really an invisible aggregate demand that's determining where the equilibrium point is. So that's the short run. I asked you to do it at, right, full employment. So if we're going to do this at full employment, then that means we're going to have something to compare it to know like what the ideal amount of production is. We have to have a measuring stick, which is our long run aggregate supply. So we're going to add long run aggregate supply to this graph. If we're at full employment, it goes right there through our intersection point. All right, so that's where we currently are. We're at the long run equilibrium if we're at full employment. So we're at long run equilibrium here. All right, so what are we going to do over here? Well, we need to add our long run Phillips curve. All you need to know is that the long run Phillips curve is the mirror of long run aggregate supply. So we come over to here, right? We add our long run Phillips curve. Boom. Goes right there. That's my long run Phillips curve. It is my mirror That's the mirror of my long run aggregate supply. So if I'm at full employment on this side, if my long run curve is running through my intersection point on this side, then my long run curve has to be running through my intersection point at this side. And now we want to label it. So down here, we use the letter U, and we don't label it full employment, probably because full employment, unemployment just sounds dumb. So we don't label it full employment. We label this, right, the amount of unemployment that we have when we're at full employment. In other words, there's no surplus of workers, there's no shortage of workers. We don't have more jobs than people that want to work. We don't have more people looking for work than jobs, that it's totally balanced. In other words, cyclical unemployment is neither positive nor negative, it's zero. We just have the frictional and the structural. We call that the natural rate of unemployment. In other words, the rate of unemployment at full employment. For the United States, we typically are going to just say that that's about 5%. Sometimes on these Phillips Curve graphs, sometimes you get asked to put some percentages on there, right? So they might tell you, like in a totally different question, they might ask you to draw a short run Phillips curve, and then they might ask you to put a long run Phillips curve. And they might tell you that the natural rate of unemployment is like, I don't know, X. And they might tell you that the current rate of unemployment is something that's like larger than X. So maybe we'll just say, like, they might tell you for this country, their natural rate of unemployment is 4, say. Then they might tell you the current rate of unemployment is 8. So then you'd be like, okay, well then that's 8. It's got to be bigger. So it goes further out the x-axis. And then they might tell you, I don't know, the current inflation rate is maybe 1. And then they might ask you what would be a possible inflation rate at full employment. So then that would be whatever, maybe 2 or 3, whatever, option fits for that, whatever. So sometimes they have you plug numbers in on the Phillips curve. You can do that. All right. So back to this graph up here. We're at full employment right here. If my intersection point was further to the left, if it was over in this area right here, right, what would that mean? Well, if my intersection point is to the left of full employment, that means that we probably, there's a couple of rare possibilities, but we probably have a recession. If my intersection point is to the left of full employment. And if my intersection point is to the right of full employment, we have an economy that's too hot, right? So this is my too cold, this is my too hot, this is my, the economy is we're below full employment, underperforming. This is above full employment. This is, a too hot economy. We've got recession and inflation. We can come over here to this graph and we can do the same thing, right? What would happen, right, if I had an unemployment rate that was below 5, if I had a low unemployment rate? Well, if we have a really low unemployment rate, 3% or something like that, right, that means that we have a really hot economy, that there's a lot of demand for workers if we have a really low unemployment rate. So that means that we're like probably producing at an unsustainable level. The economy's too hot. So if I'm in this area down here, that's inflation. That's a too hot economy if we're in that area down there. Over here, right? If I'm at an unemployment rate above 5%, 7%, 8%, right? If we're at an unemployment rate at 8%, that's a too cold economy. That's a recession. Okay. So, right, there you go. We can see the mirror once more. This right here just flops over and is mirrored right here. It's the exact same thing. The only difference, like even the inflation, recession, it all flops over, it all folds and mirrors. The only thing that's missing is that invisible aggregate demand. All right, so now what I want you guys to do, part 2, now assume that many small business owners begin to fear a recession is coming. Show the effect on both graphs. So using these same, don't draw new ones. We're going to do new ones in a minute. On these graphs right here, I want you to show me what would happen if a bunch of small business owners began to fear a recession. Literally, this was in the news 2 days ago. Maybe it was yesterday. Like 2 days ago, Bureau of Labor Statistics does a big survey of small business owners, and like it's at a lowest point in like 8 months about them, what they feel like about for the future and things like that. So business owners right now not feeling very, small business owners not feeling very good about the future. What does that mean for both of these graphs? So take a minute, make your best guess. So a couple weeks ago, when I went over aggregate demand, aggregate supply with you guys, one of the things that I said is when we have a change in our economy, right, 90% of the time, it's going to be a change in aggregate demand, which means a change in spending on SIGICs, consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, foreign spending. So whenever we get something like this, now assume blah, 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 here's a change. How is it going to affect this, right? The first thing we should ask ourselves is this going to affect SIGICs? Does this affect consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, foreign spending, right? If it's not one of these things, if it's something that's like, if it's like resource based, like resource prices or productivity or technology, if it's something resourcey, then it's going to be supply that would shift. But if it's not resourcey, it's probably SIGICs, like 90% of the time, it's going to be a demand shift, right? So let's look at this, right? Assume that many small business owners begin to fear a recession. Is this going to affect consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, foreign spending? The answer is undoubtedly yes. That what's going to happen with small business owners when they fear a recession is that they're going to stop spending money to expand their businesses. That's what investment is, business spending. So we're going to see a reduction in business spending. This is the exact story I saw on the news like yesterday or the day before, was that they were talking about how there's this fear that, as we're trying to get our economy going out of the pandemic, that small businesses being afraid of a recession are going to cut back on spending. They're not opening new locations. They're not buying new equipment. They're not hiring more workers, right? This is the fear that they're not putting their money back into their business. So let's come over to this graph. We'll first go on aggregate demand, aggregate supply. We'll use purple. Nice neutral color. Neither recession nor inflation. And we're going to show a decrease in business spending. So we draw our arrow. We draw our parallel curve. We label it. We identify our new equilibrium. Right? And we report out what's happening. My price level is falling. My output is falling. Now, let's go back to our Phillips curve. How do we show this over here? Well, right, think about what's happening here. My invisible aggregate demand curve is shifting, right? So if my invisible aggregate demand is shifting, then that means this point right here, my intersection point, it's going to have to move, right? So it's going to have to move along this curve. It's going to have to go up or it's going to have to go down that curve. Now, remember, my prices have to line up. So we can just go straight across from right here. And that's going to show us exactly where the point's going to move to. Still on my short run Phillips curve, because my intersection, this is not moving. So it's got to stay on that curve. But now, right, aggregate demand. So we can see here, aggregate demand shifts left here. It would shift right here. So we can see that. Or if you want, you could think if my point is moving down to the left over here, it's got to move down to the right over here because it's mirrored. Whatever helps you make sense of that. There you go. There we go. So what's happening here? My inflation rate is falling. My unemployment rate is going up. Does that make sense with what's happening here? Absolutely. Price level down, inflation rate down, that makes sense. Output down, unemployment up, that makes sense. So what we've done here is we've now shown this change in the economy on both graphs. All right. So I'm going to do 2 more of these with you and then we'll be done. All right. So this is the first kind of example, these side-by-side graphs. What I want you to do next is I want you to do a side-by-side graph of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and the long and short run Phillips curves. And I want you to start at an inflationary gap. So start with an inflationary gap. And then, so you should start working on that. And then I'll have a follow-up question that goes along with it as well. All right. So I gave you a second there to get a head start. Maybe you're still working, that's fine. Or maybe you're sitting there and you're like, I still don't really quite get this. And so you're waiting for Mr. Tweet to make the first move. That's fine as well. So again, side-by-side graphs. We want to line up our x-axis, our x-axes. There we go. We've got our side-by-side graphs. We want to make our big X, and then we want to add our short run Phillips curve. I'm going to go through and I'm going to label all this stuff that I've got up here so far. All right, so I've got my short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, short run Phillips curve. I got my labels on my axes here. Step 2, line them up. Right, we want to line up our equilibrium with our starting point. We want to line up our equilibrium with our starting inflation rate. So there we go. We've got our 2 graphs lined up. Now, the last thing we need to do to set up our side-by-side graphs is we need to add our long run curves. So to do that, I'm going to start over here. That's my current output. If I've got an inflationary gap, my output, when you have an inflationary economy, your output is greater than full employment. So if this is my output and it's greater than full employment, right? If it's greater than full employment, that shows you where full employment's got to go. That full employment's got to go to the left because it's less than my current. So I'm going to drop that somewhere like there. Boom. I've got an inflationary gap. Long run average supply there. So this is now an inflationary gap. Guess what we're going to do over here? We're just going to mirror it. We're just going to use that mirror to just, so that means that if my point is to the left over here, it's going to have to go on the right side over here. So I drop this down. That's my current unemployment rate. And now I'm going to put a line off to the right. Boom. There we go. Just like that. Maybe I want to move it a little bit over from there. I think that looks a little bit better. Doesn't really matter. You'll see why in a minute. Doesn't really matter there. So there you go. I've got my long run aggregate supply here. I've got my long run Phillips curve mirroring it on the other side here. You can see that my unemployment rate is currently below my natural rate of unemployment. So that means that I have low levels of unemployment, right? Inflationary gap. We don't have very many workers. We have a lot more job openings than workers to fill them. It's an inflationary economy driving prices up. Okay, so here we are. We've got our side-by-side graphs. All right. Remember, if you have questions at any point, just put those in the chat and I'll address your questions. I'll fit them into what I'm doing here. So I've got my side-by-side graphs. Now let's look at my follow-up question. This is this is the hardest of the three questions I'm giving you today. This is the hardest one. This is a question that usually tricks a lot of students, or I shouldn't say tricks, but a lot of students find it hard. What happens in the long run if the government takes no policy action? So the government decides to do nothing and let this thing fix itself in the long run, right? I want you to explain what's going to happen, and I want you to show it on both of these graphs, all right? Don't draw any new graphs, both of these two right here. I want to know what's going to happen in the long run if the government takes no policy action, all right? So take a moment, try to figure out your answer. I'll be back and I'll go over the answer with you. So if you're sitting here stuck, right, the first thing you need to figure out is what happens from the short run to the long run, right? If we say what happens in the long run, right, if we've gone from the short run to the long run, you have to figure out what that is. And the good news is the answer is the exact same every single time. There's only one difference between the short run and the long run in macroeconomics. The only difference is that in the short run, wages and resource prices are sticky. In the long run, wages and resource prices can move. They can adjust to the economy. They can go up or they can go down, right? So in the short run, wages and resource prices are sticky. In the long run, they're going to change, right? So that's going to be our shifter, right? To explain what's going to happen, right? We're going to say whatever happens is going to happen because wages are going to change. So how are wages going to change? That's our key. Well, here's our answer. The short run Phillips curve shows us that our unemployment level is very low. There's a shortage of workers, right? So if there's a shortage of workers, that goes back to unit 2. If supply goes down, right, price goes up, right? So workers are hard to find. So they're going to be demanded by the market. Their price is going to go up, right? So what's going to happen to wages, right? Also, if it helps, you can think of it this way, right? That if we have an inflationary gap and the price level is increasing, if inflation is going up, those workers are going to demand higher wages as well. So as long as it's an inflationary gap, that inflation is going to drive up wages as well. The only time where that relationship between prices and wages doesn't exactly hold true, the only time it kind of fails is when you have stagflation. That when you have a stagflation economy, then there's prices are going up and workers might demand higher wages, but the lack of production means workers are getting laid off and it's going to drive wages down in the long run. But as long as it's an inflationary economy, an inflationary gap, then workers are going to demand higher wages to keep up with that inflation, and they're going to get them because of the shortage of labor. So in the long run, wages go up. Wages are a resource price, and remember, resourcey things, they shift short-run aggregate supply, right? So if wages are going up and workers are being paid more, what that's going to do is it's going to cause businesses to say, you know what? During this inflationary economy, when the price of my product was going up, but my workers' wages was still flat, I could make extra money. I wanted to grow my business. But now that I have to actually pay my workers more, right? Not so interested in that. So what we see is my short-run aggregate supply, when wages go up, it's going to decrease. Okay? So it's going to decrease to the left. Boom, look at that. Our new intersection point on my long-run curve. Beautiful. Label my new line. There's my new price. My output is at the full employment level. So what do we do over here? Well, remember, short-run Phillips curve is the mirror of short-run aggregate supply. So if short-run aggregate supply is going to the left, short-run Phillips curve is going to go to the right. And the question is, how far? And the answer is, we have all the clues we need to know exactly where it's going to shift to. Right? My new intersection point has to be on this line because my Y values have to line up. Also, if I'm at full employment here, I've got to be at full employment here. So it's got to be on this Y and it's got to be on this X. That tells me my new point has to sit right here. Boom, there you go. Short run Phillips curve 1. Label my new inflation level. And look at that. Full employment, natural rate of unemployment, my price level and inflation are lined up. There you go. That's the answer to the question. So like I said, that's a really hard one. The question of what happens in the long run is a really difficult question for students. But I wanted to show you what happens. The reason why I asked this is because I wanted to show you what happens when we get a shift to our short run aggregate supply, how it causes a mirror shift over here. So I got a question in the chat that says, is it safe to say that every time there is no policy action, short run aggregate supply shifts to close the gap? And if there is fiscal policy, that aggregate demand shifts to close the gap? That is 100% true. That is exactly where we're going. So the next question I'm going to give you is going to be a fiscal policy question. So you're already like one step ahead of me on that. So that's where we're headed. And it's totally true. The one thing I do want to say though, is that if you have like an AP test question, or if you have a test question for me, and if I ask why, to explain why it happens, your explanation can't be that short run aggregate supply is, it shifts to close the gap or something like that. Your explanation has to be what's causing that to happen, right? That it's the wages that causes that short run aggregate supply doesn't, just shift on its own. It's not like, a sentient being or anything like that. Short run aggregate supply just responds to those market forces. So let's do one more question together. All right. So that was a fantastic question. And it really is like, where we're going to be in 10 minutes is exactly what I'm headed towards. So, all right, last one, side-by-side graph of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, long and short run Phillips curves. We're going to do side-by-side graphs one more time, but this time I want you to start with a recessionary gap. All right, so side-by-side graphs, starting with the recessionary gap. All righty, so let's look at our side-by-side graphs here. So we've got our side-by-side graphs, right? Again, we always start the same way with that right there, right? Let's label some stuff. All right, so we started with our short run curves. Step 2, line them up. Boom. So there we go. Line them up. We've got my current equilibrium here, and I've got my current equilibrium shown over here. Again, invisible aggregate demand. All right, let's label these. Current price level, current inflation level, and next step is to add the long run curves. I've got my current output there. If this is a recessionary gap, if our economy is in recession, then that means my current output is less than full employment. See how that works compared to the last one? Boom, erase that, and there you go. It shows you where your full employment goes. So I've got my full employment there. Let's just throw a curve in our vertical line. Oh, that thing was terrible. It's not even straight at all, but whatever. Doesn't really matter. Long run, aggregate supply. There we go. So now over here, we just got to do the mirror. If my full employment is to the right over here, it's going to be to the left over here. So I want something like, there we go. That's my long run Phillips curve, right? We've got the mirroring going on. The only thing missing is aggregate demand. Doesn't matter. Right. So here we are. We've drawn our recessionary gap. Now what I want you to do, my follow-up question, is now assume the government wants to end the recession in the short run, right? Because if we wait for the long run to fix this thing, it could take years to fix this, right? And that's years of people's lives. It's lost wages where people are unemployed. It's people using up their retirement before they're retired. So it's going to lead to problems in the future. It leads to, substance abuse with stress that people are under. All kinds of problems come from a recession. So the government's like, you know what? Let's try to end this recession now instead of waiting, right? This is exactly what our government's doing right now, by the way. That just this last week, like President Biden proposed that we spend $1.6 trillion, right, to try to fix this problem. So I want you to show me, right, I want you to tell me what the government can do to close the gap and then show me on both graphs, right? So take a moment to do that and then I'll go over it with you. All righty. So what can the government do to close this gap? Well, if you look at our graph, right, if we wanted to close this recessionary gap right here, we could kind of do it in two ways. We could either take aggregate demand and we could kind of move aggregate demand, that would close my gap, or we can move short run aggregate supply and that would close my gap, right? So the question is like, which one is, would we actually do? Well, the reality is it's really hard to shift short run aggregate supply. That, you could maybe use some sort of kind of like, deregulation or maybe some sort of like tax incentives of the right, not even tax incentives on production, not on, it's shifting aggregate supply is pretty tough. Shifting aggregate demand is a lot easier, right? Remember, aggregate demand is spending on SIGICs. So if the government wants to change this, this is actually a lot easier to do. First of all, if the government wants to change this, the government controls that right there. They choose how much they spend. So immediately, if the government wants to shift aggregate demand, it could just spend more or spend less. So they just change their government spending, right? If we have a recession, they could just choose to spend more. That would increase aggregate demand. If we have an inflationary gap, they could choose to spend less and that would decrease aggregate demand. So government spending is one option. The other option that we have is that they can try to influence C&I. The way that they influence consumer and business spending is by changing taxes. Because when I cut taxes, if I'm the government, then it leaves more money in the hands of consumers. Consumer spending goes up or business spending goes up. Or if I raise taxes, they have less money to spend. So then, spending would go down. So the government directly controls this and the government indirectly influences this with taxes. And those are your two answers. So what can the government do to close the gap? In this case, they can cut taxes or they can increase spending. Right now in our economy, like I said, we have kind of this recession coming out of the pandemic. The government has decided that it wants to try to boost aggregate demand. The way that they do that is they have a $1.6 billion bill that's been proposed by President Biden that includes a combination of tax cuts, basically what the stimulus payment would be. So tax cuts or direct spending by the government on goods and services. So it's like a combination of these two things right here to try to boost aggregate demand. Now, show it on the graphs. This is the last thing for us to do. So if I wanted to show this on the graph, right? We're going to increase aggregate demand. We draw our arrow to the right. We draw our parallel curve. That's pretty close to closing that gap. We label it. And there you go, we're back at full employment in the short run, right? We boosted aggregate demand and it gets us back on this line where we want to be in full, full employment. Last thing we need to do is we need to show this over here on this graph right here. So notice, right? A shift of aggregate demand leads to a move on my graph right here. If my point is moving up into the right over here, it's going to move up into the left over here. How far does it move? That's an easy question, right? Back to full employment. And ideally, those line up as well. So there you go. We're back at full employment on both graphs. Now, what would happen if the government was to overdo it and spend more money than, overdo the shift of aggregate demand? What if they shifted it too far? I bet most of you are sitting there to yourselves right now and you're saying, if we shifted aggregate demand too far, most of you are sitting there and you're saying we'd have an inflationary gap, which is exactly the criticism that some people who are, last week, Republican former Secretary of the Treasury, he wrote an article, very influential, last week, and he was like, look, I'm a smart economist. I think 1.6 trillion is too much because it's going to lead to an inflationary gap. So we'll see. But anyways, that's the Phillips curve, right? So you should understand this pretty well now, actually. The aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, you should have down at this point right now. This should be almost easy for you, right? Also, I introduced you guys to fiscal policy. That's what this is right here. Changing taxes or changing government spending to close gaps is fiscal policy, right? We're going to go over that a little bit more next time. I'll go over the money multiplier with you, and then we're going to start monetary policy. We'll look at the money market, and maybe even we'll get into monetary policy next week as well, in addition to the money market. So one last thing before you guys disappear. I would like, if you are, well, those of you who are watching on video, I'm going to stop the recording now. So see you guys later.